Welcome, everyone, to the 11th Annual Hamptons Doc Fest, our new name, a new year, and we're delighted to have you here, especially tonight. We are doing our first co-presentation with the Sag Harbor Cinema Arts Center, which is going to be a new and wonderful center.
Okay, so how you know how special this is? We had a big world premiere in Venice for the film, and Rick didn't make it, but he made it to Sag Harbor.
G.E. brought his guitar.
G's brought his guitar.
Rick, look.
I'll just tell you quick, and then we'll let the people that made the movie and are in the movie talk. The movie stars. Yeah. I love it. I'm so happy that they made a movie about Rick, Storr, and Cindy, and what goes on there, because it's real. It's the most real place you could ever walk into. A lot of it you shot in the summertime, you know? Yeah. I'm used to walking down that street when it's, you know how it gets in New York, when it's cold, right? You know, and I'll be walking down there and I gotta pee, you know? And I'll go, wow, Rick's, I'll go to Rick's, you know? And you gotta know where that little door is in that workshop. Because that workshop's really like that all the time, but he knows where every single thing is. I'll go and say, Rick, I need a little bolt, you know, that goes on it. Yeah, I got one over here. And he goes right to it. And he's got it, you know. But we used to talk about, we'd sit around in the store and talk about these guitars, it's pine wood, you know, that was in these old roof beams. Rick had gotten these big pine roof beams from Jim's Loft in the Bowery. We would talk about how Leo Fender, the prototype Fenders, Leo just went down to the lumber yard in Fullerton, California and got some pine and glued it together and cut out this shape, you know? So we talked about that. You know, Rick would say, I got this great pine now, I'm gonna make some guitars. And then we talked about, well, make pine necks too, Rick. Yeah. And so he just did it. I don't know if anybody here has ever tried to work with wood. I'm pitiful, I can't sharpen a pencil. And you see the way Rick is there with those tools, doing that? Try to do that. It won't do it. If I try to do it, the wood kicks back on you and it just, these are real craftsmen here.
But G and Rick, what makes pine so special about the sound?
Oh, well, it's the soundboard wood that they would use in a piano or a violin or a cello. It's conifers have been used for over 5,000 years as soundboards and acoustic instruments, especially stringed instruments. And Stradivarius actually used pine for the tops of his violins, not spruce. Everybody thinks it's spruce, but it was a type of balsam pine that grew in Cremona where he lived. And so I knew it was going to be good wood. Plus, like G said, Leo actually started making the first guitars out of pine because he was making amps first before he made guitars. And he had a pile of pine laying there for the amp wood, and he glued them up together, and it just was, okay, this sounds really good. And that fortunately worked because they almost stopped making those guitars. They weren't selling right away. But fortunately for me, they did start selling, and well, anyway, that's what makes, you know, pine a good wood for guitars.
I like to, because Jim Jarmusch was mentioned before, I think Jim was also part of the idea of you trying to make guitar from reclaimed New York City wood, and it was also the source of the film. Can you both talk about this?
Yeah, well, the first wood actually came from Jim's loft. He actually was doing his roof rafters over and offered me the wood, and I said, yeah, sure, because I had already made a couple from pine before that. My friend T grew up in a house in Virginia, and we made some of the first ones out of that wood. So that's really where it came from first. But yeah, I think Jim was also an instigator for this movie too, right, Ron?
Yeah, well, I was at the festival called Big Ears, which is in Knoxville, Tennessee, and Jim was noticing that, or started talking about Rick and his guitars, because Bill Frisell was there and Steve Gunn and a number of other musicians were playing Rick Kelly guitars. And I innocently asked, who's Rick Kelly? And so then they told me all about Rick, and then the next day they were really on me, like you have to go into the store, and that's how the film happened. And Carter Logan, who is Jim's producer, actually is the executive producer on this film. Mm-hmm. I'm curious. What were you doing before?
Well, I've always used reclaimed lumber ever since
Right.
I was in college in 1968. I started building instruments, and I was in art school at the time and had no money, and I was trying to make sculpture out of timbers that came from the state park at the time. But I was always looking for cheap wood, and I knew that old wood was better. Old instruments always cost more. For what reason? Because they sound better. They're played a lot, And that was kind of also the mystery to me, is why do they sound better just because they're played a lot? And it has to do on a really weird mystery of the molecules in the wood, how they react to vibration, and over time they just sound better and better. But yeah, it was always just a matter of getting wood inexpensively at first, and then it was finding the old wood to make them out of was definitely going to be a good thing.
I mean, Rick is a visionary. He's one of the first to recognize that wood makes a difference in solid body electric guitars. There weren't that many people who really thought that.
I don't think they really thought too much of that. I mean, there was a lot of great solid body builders before me, and a lot of them used beautiful exotic woods. Limbic was one of my favorite. It was a beautiful guitar made from real exotic timbers and woods from South America and all. But I kind of wanted to use the USA wood, New York, some local woods and domestic woods, and New York City wood was, all right, yeah, that sounds great. Let's get a piece of old New York, the bones of these old buildings. This is a great idea,
That is so cool, the New York City thing. This bass is, if I remember right, I call it the BC. I don't know if you can see that BC. It's Chelsea Hotel and a Bowery.
Yeah, Bowery.
Right.
Yeah.
What could be cooler than that?
So now it has a name. It's CB.
Yeah, right? There it is.
How much you all see the film also as a metaphor for what's happening in New York and the way that the village is changing? I actually live 3 blocks from the store, so I'm very sensitive about the way things are going, and have been going for several years. And Ron, you're not from New York, but you lived there for, earlier on. So how much this is also about the city?
Yeah. Cindy.
Cindy, what do you think?
About the city?
Yeah, the changes.
Well, I mean, I just turned 27, and even for someone my age, I've seen a lot of change. By the time I was about 15, I was going to punk shows all the time, in St. Mark's and the Lower East Side, and I lived in Harlem right out of high school for a while. Even Harlem, I've seen a lot of changes all over the place, but especially in the past 5 years or so, it's definitely, there are major, major changes. I mean, even the coffee shops that are new are flipping every, couple months, right?
Yeah, it's like what Rebo was saying, how it's really nice to be able to just come in, and it's like part of a community. And it has, like Ron said, it's kind of like a post office, too. People will leave stuff for, can you give this to Jim when he comes in,
Yeah, that happened the other day, and we were thinking of you.
Yeah.
Who was it?
Yeah, I don't know. Somebody left something
One
for
of the
somebody,
girls left something for some other musician, and we were like, oh.
And you will be eventually.
I like a
Yeah.
post office.
Well, Rick, your place is one of the last. Now that Matt's gone, Matt Umanoff had the store around the corner. Now that that's gone, and
Walked the showcases over.
Rick's place, which I think you can see in this film here, it's so welcoming when you come in there. The people that I would meet in there. When Rick's mom is dusting, and that one photo that keeps going to the side, that's Bob Quine. Now, Bob passed away. Bob was a great guitar player and a really wonderful human being. I met him in Rick's store and got to be good friends with him.
That's my favorite picture of the two of you. That dead of winter, you're both all bundled up in
Yeah,
coats.
yeah. Chris Whitley, who's also gone, I met in Rick's store. And all those great guitar players that you saw there, the reason that they played so well in this is because they're comfortable in there. It's really comfortable when you go in there. I'm glad it's still there.
Ron, there's something very beautiful about the structure of the film and the way you have the days and the way you give a song, you know, that the music is played for a long time. And I just wonder, you have a very intuitive way you get to make your films. I wonder how you got to this structure, because you remember you called me one day, you said, I'm making a film about the store in the village, you know, and I was like, oh, okay.
Well, we didn't know what we were doing. We just like thought who was going to show up and who's on tour. We actually tried to get you. I'm not sure you knew
Yeah,
that.
how come I'm not in that movie, man? I thought,
but
did you edit
your
me out?
No, your photograph is in there, actually. I was so happy to see that. I went, oh, yeah, that's GE. But a lot of it was dependent on the musicians' schedules. You were on tour, and a lot of musicians who were, regulars at the store, were going to come in, or they were out of town. And it was serendipity. The 5-day structure came, so we're talking a lot about Jim Jarmusch, but Jim made a film called Patterson, which was 5 days in the life of a poet, and which was just love that movie, and I loved the structure of it, and I also liked his film Coffee and Cigarettes, which was also just conversations. So the idea of musicians that came in and talked to Rick was Coffee and Cigarettes, and the 5-day structure was really Patterson that I borrowed, stole, but he was good with it since it was, he pushed me into this thing.
We customized the guitar in that movie too.
What guitar?
We customized the guitar in that movie too.
Patterson?
Patterson.
Yeah.
Yes, that was.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah, and that's the other crazy connection.
It was an
with him.
Esteban.
Yeah.
The Harlequin.
Yeah, the Harlequin Esteban.
The other, we made a movie about Robert Altman, the previous film, and Bob made these movies that were really big, and then he made smaller movies. And one of the movies that I watched prior to this film was Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean, because I wanted how did he work in a small space? And so a lot of it was, so that was another inspiration in terms of how do you actually make a movie in one space. And then when you went outside, I wanted to sort of talk about gentrification, but do it in a way that wasn't just over the top. So whenever you went outside, there was loud banging and construction outside, and try to make the point that way.
It is beautiful the way you frame the trees, because it feels like it's like a protective thing and you're inside.
Right. Yeah, it really is magical when you go. If you're ever in New York,
Go see Rick.
go see Rick.
Ron, can I ask you something, man?
Yeah, sure.
The technical things, it looks beautiful on the screen, and it's beautiful, but also, how did you get the sound so good?
Yeah, well, that's
When that one woman was singing, the quality of her voice.
Yeah, I'll tell Mike that. Mike's he's
Great
he's
job.
an incredible sound guy.
We gave him a New York name. It's Mike. What's his
Mike
name?
the Mike.
Yeah, we
Mike
call him
Guccino.
Mike Guccino. Now he's Mike the Mike.
Mike the
Yeah.
Mike, yeah. Hey, Mike the Mike, hey.
Yeah, I mean, it was important. It's a music film, so
Yeah.
I was from the very first film that I made, which was about Cecil Taylor and Archie Shepp and Bill
Really?
Dixon. I put them in a studio, and because I really cared about the sound. So sound makes picture look better.
Right.
And I knew also, but it is Rick's guitars. I mean, that's the tonality of even Sexton
Yeah, the
playing
tonality
at the end.
could,
It was
but
holy
you
cow.
got it somehow. It's there. It
Yeah.
comes out. I was
It's
just
also
sitting there, and it's there.
Yeah, Phil's amplifiers are so clean.
Yeah, that's it. They're
That's
all-
the other thing
they're
that went through.
Philcos, too, yeah.
You can talk about
Handmade
Phil's
guitars
amps.
and handmade amps. Yeah, Phil makes them
Yeah.
all from
Right.
scratch with really good internals.
Handmade amps.
His amplifiers are all made by hand. They're all wired like original amps, and he uses only the best equipment that he can put into them. Best tubes, best wire. I mean, he gets crazy about it. He'll pay $40 for
Yeah.
one capacitor, when you can get it for 50 cents. But, he doesn't skimp on the parts. And they come through. They sound really amazing.
And Quine had a big part in that too.
Oh, yeah.
why
yeah.
he started
Yeah.
building.
Yeah,
That
that's
was all
right.
with
yeah.
Quine,
That
yeah.
was Bob, too.
And then I use Foley a lot too in
Yeah.
this film, you know, and that isn't used in documentary that much, and so
Do you want to explain what Foley is?
well, it's post sound, so that there's a guy who is, or there's a whole team of people, who are creating sounds when Rick is like even brushing strings. It may be enhanced by a secondary sound source, which is a Foley artist creating it in post.
So how notorious, Rick, are you among construction sites in New York?
I didn't hear you.
How notorious are you among construction sites of all buildings
Oh,
in New
yeah, they see me coming now, and they all go inside, and I have to go, all right, I'll come back later, you know. Oh, here's the guy that wants the wood.
If you have any question, it's a little dark, but please raise your hand. Oh, there is one there.
Can you give a little description as to what it looked like in the store on the other side of the camera?
What do you mean by?
Behind the camera.
How many cameras and equipment?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's
Sure.
so simple, too.
There were two
Yeah.
cameras. I had two different crews. We started with one crew, and then a second crew came in, but it was basically a skeletal crew of myself, John Tran, Becky. Usually two cameras, a sound person, an assistant. So there were four of
like
us,
four,
you know, and then someone watching the door
Yeah.
sometimes.
It's a
But that's-
railroad style, like old school New York building. So there's the front shop, which is like consignment, new stuff, and our guitars that we've finished, and the computer where Dorothy sits and all that stuff. And then there's a little hole doorway in the wall and a window. And the back shop is back there, which is probably a little bit bigger than the front.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll
And
tell
that's
you
where
what.
all the wood
Yeah.
and everything else
Yeah, it's a great
is.
building, 1827. It actually was a speakeasy,
Yeah.
although there were 15,000
story.
speakeasies during Prohibition in Greenwich Village alone.
Yeah.
But that was one of them, for sure. I actually found the door. There were the sliding Joe sent me, and they would let you in, you know.
Rick
Yeah.
wants to make it the bathroom
Yeah, I want
door.
to make it the bathroom door.
Oh, he can.
Joe sent me.
You know, one of the most difficult parts of the movie was continuity, and I was doing continuity,
Yeah.
and the reason it was difficult was there were, you know, I would have to set up guitars on the stands, and when we would break or come back the next day, I would put the guitars back the way they were. But then there would be a guitar missing, and I'd ask
yeah.
Rick,
We'd-
like, what
if we
happened
sell
to that
something.
guitar? And he said, I just sold it. It's like, wait a minute. How do I do continuity if you have all these guitars?
So interested in the reclaimed wood part of your process. Did you always start out doing that? Or did you start with like, store-bought wood? And what was the first building that you built?
Yeah, like I said, my reclaiming wood and recycling wood goes all the way back to my days in college, making sculpture before I even started making guitars. So as soon as I started making guitars, it was find old wood. What can I get? Where can I get old wood? So it was always finding old reclaimed boards. I used to go to farm auctions. I had a shop down in Maryland for a while after college. I went to college in Baltimore, and I would go to these farm auctions, and it was really sad because all the farms in Maryland were going out of business, going under, and they would have these big auction, and they would sell everything, kitchen equipment, furniture, and nobody ever bought or bid on the wood that was in these outbuildings. And half the time it was great-granddaddy's old wood that had been there for generations. And I would get truckloads of wood, and I still have wood from some of those farm auctions, some old rock maple from Arkansas, and just incredible wood that nobody cared about that. They wanted the tractor and the kitchen sink,
With old wood, how confident are you of the sound that's going to result? As quarter sawn, flat sawn, the cutouts for the electronics.
Yeah, that's definitely a consideration when you're making the necks, especially. You want to have the wood cut on the quarter. In other words, if you were to look at the end grain, it would be up and down, straight up and down, which, yeah, you can see the top of GE's headstock there, how that lines go nice and straight. So I look for pieces that, unfortunately, this wood comes from trees that were 300 years old. They were huge trees, had never been cut down. The Indians were living here. There weren't any, any buildings or anything yet. So when they started building the city, they had all this wood that they would bring down the Hudson River on barges from the Adirondacks and right up until the Bronx. There was nothing but trees. So all this wood is incredible stuff, and they don't realize this. They throw it away, and it just breaks my heart that when I can't bring it back to the shop, I see this wood, and it'll wind up in the ocean and probably end up somewhere in Japan, on the shores of Japan or somewhere, wherever the tidal waves take it, and it's everything I can get, I grab. Special stuff. But yeah, you do have to be concerned about the grain of the wood, but the sound, it's guaranteed it's going to be great, because when the wood sits indoors for 170 years, and that alchemy of the hot and cold, especially when it gets closer to the roof, the wood actually gets blackened in color, and all the resins in the wood just crystallize and disappear. So if you look at wood under a microscope, you'll see it's just like a pile of straws. It's just these open tubes, and that's where the vibrations travel. And that's why I say when soundboards from pianos, violins, or whatever choose this wood, it's because it vibrates so well. And it's the chosen wood for soundboards of all stringed instruments. So it's the same stuff.
The big companies now that make guitars, Gibson and Fender, they make some great guitars. Martin, there's a bunch of them. They can't use wood like Rick does. They can't get enough of it because they got to make thousands and thousands and thousands of guitars real fast. They get wood, and they're trying all kinds of things, drying it in a kiln and torrefying, whatever that
All
means.
this new stuff where
They scare the wood into being, and they doing some great guitars, but it doesn't have what these have.
Yeah, they
And
definitely.
some of them are getting old wood from places that are kind of copying what Rick's been doing.
Yes, a lot of people are copying
but
Rick
it's
now.
not even
That is the
same
truth.
Or as good even. Like this, I don't remember which one it was. It wasn't. It's like very thin top pieces or something for one of them that they're selling for like a bajillion dollars more, and it's interesting seeing Fender and them copy Rick.
Well, this stuff is full of nails, so there's a lot of
That's the
nail
other
pulling,
thing.
and it's old iron cut nails. So they leave the metal filings in there. So when you cut this wood, if you run into any of those metal filings, we try to get all the nails up, but occasionally they'll break off and there'll be a piece. The bandsaw blade hits it, boom, that's the end of that blade. You need a new blade. So factory's not going to do what we do to get the nails out and to deal with the wood that's full of nails. They're just not going to deal with that. Plus now there's actually embargoes on a lot of wood. Gibson had a lot of problems because they were getting some Brazilian rosewood that was kind of being smuggled through Mexico and in Germany and coming in. And they get raided by the feds. They raided them and took all the guitars and all the wood, and it took them a while to actually make agreements that they would only get their wood from Fiji now. And a lot of that mahogany is the same stuff you would see in the old doors of suburban houses. It's like Luan. It's very soft mahogany. So all of a sudden I'm seeing lots of broken headstocks because the wood is not the old Honduras that the old guitars were made of back in the day. So wood, I never thought I'd see the day when wood would be a scarcity and hard to find. Now it's hard to get ebony, all the silver, the flutes, and all the horns that were made of solid ebony. They're exploding on the lathe because there's so many fires in Africa now that there's very little good ebony to make the flutes and the oboes and whatnot out of. So wood is getting scarce. We're seeing it in our own lifetime. You can't get Indian rosewood. Brazilian rosewood, forget about it. You're not allowed to touch that stuff. Brazil has a tree called the Brazil nut tree. It's their cash crop where they get the Brazil nuts. So they don't let Brazilian rosewood leave the country anymore. And now India is doing the same thing. You want to build something out of Indian rosewood, you have to go to India to make your product. You can't just get the wood anymore. So it's getting really tough to find good wood for major factories.
On the average, how long, like from start to finish, like sorely, how long does it take to make it, a guitar?
Well, me and Cindy are doing about 3 guitars a month, 3 or 4 guitars a month now, about 1 a week almost on those. Yeah.
Thank you for making this film. It's a wonderful
Thanks,
window
Ron.
into this.
Thank you, Ron.
And my question is, how many guitars have you made in your lifetime?
How many guitars?
Well, the Bowery series, I numbered the first 100 and then I stopped. And I know we've gone past 200, so I don't really know.
There's more.
But there's, when I first started making guitars, I would number them. And I got up to around 800 or 900, and then I stopped doing that too. So, I think that's the problem with a lot of instrument makers in general. I think, I don't know, at Stradivarius, they say made around 1,000 instruments, and none of them were numbered, so nobody really knows. And we have a tendency to do stuff like that where we don't really keep track. Martin Guitars has the best system. Every guitar is very easy to tell how old it is when it was made. They have excellent documentation, but Gibson, not so much so, and a lot of other companies, not so much so. So, it's nice to, in history, if you can go back and open it up and say, oh, this one was made then, and it was signed and whatnot. But
I kind of date mine in the neck with Roman numerals.
yes.
So by the day and the month and everything, so I don't even know where I'm at, but they're kind of, for the most part, there for me.
I have a question for Cindy. Cindy, I like a little bit about your backstory. You have a very moving moment in the film when you say, I don't know what I would do if there wasn't for this place, and you.
Yeah.
So tell us about your first meeting with Rick, and how did you start working there? And
My first meeting with Rick, well, when I was in high school, I grew up playing guitar because of my dad, who was playing for 40 years. And throughout high school, I had found out about Rick's guitars through the Gear page and a bunch of online forums, which I was following and typing on and whatever. And I had just known who he was, but even being, I grew up in Jersey and I was in the city all the time, I still never visited his shop. I worked Rock Center, making money, bartending, suit and tie, until that place got shut down, doubled the rent like everywhere else. And I got good unemployment, and I kind of said, what am I going to do now? Am I going to try to get into a gallery painting like I was? Because I had a full scholarship to Pratt University and some other things going on. And I kind of really always wanted to build guitars, but I didn't want to go out to a school in the West, and I wanted to stay in New York. And Rick was #1, and really it was kind of like one of those things, if I don't get in with him, I'm probably not going to do it. But I decided to kind of walk into Carmine Street for the first time and tell him my story. And it was actually when I first moved to Flatbush, which I've been at for quite a few years now. But it was the hottest day, and I took, I was up in Harlem, so the trains were new for me, coming from where I was, and it was like 105 degrees, so I walked like 15 extra blocks, and I was sweating by the time I got there, and I was like, oh my God, this guy's never gonna he's gonna think I'm a total mess. But I walked in, and I kind of, I was looking around, and Rick and one of the Bum Squad guys, Ron, our buddy Ron, he was sitting there eating lunch, and Rick was working on a guitar in the front. And I was looking around, and Rick kind of said, can I help you? And I said, maybe, and I said, this is my story, this is what I want to do. And Rick said, well, I can't pay you. And I said, no, that's okay. Where I'm at, I just want to learn, I want to build, and this is what I want to do. And he said, well, go sit down, I'll show you the back, answer the phones, and I've been there ever since now. I never left. He's stuck with me.
And now you're making your own guitar.
And
She's got her own line of guitars.
Yeah, and he
singing
really
guitars.
pushed me to do the art stuff too, because I didn't think that was something that anybody would really be interested in. But I've had steady orders ever since, and that's kind of grown into something unexpected, because our whole thing is really, first and foremost, the tone and the playability and, the workhorse of a guitar that it is. And I think a lot of people look at what I'm doing and go, wait, you make the guitars? It's like, well, I thought you were just decorating guitars. It's like, no. It's like for the people who appreciate it and want it, it's there. But that's really where it's, yeah.
Okay, well, I just have one question for Ron. I've been, showing your film for many, many years, and they have this sort of simple first impact, and then they are like so layered and so complicated and so beautifully about the specific. How do you frame this within the rest of your work?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I have, ask me an easier question. I make films about, my mentor was Emile D'Antonio, a political documentary filmmaker. And Dee once told me there were two reasons for doing anything. You either love something intensely or you dislike something intensely. I fell in love with Rick Kelly and Cindy and Carmine street guitars and wanted to make a movie about it. And it's really everything that I do. I just am directed by, you just fall in love with something.
Good.
And I think that's really the only reason for doing anything. So that's the context. I also make films about my heroes. I think a lot of the art or a lot of the work that I'm a fan. Deep down, a geeky fan. I was a jazz fan and a comic book person and a fan of Robert Altman films. And I think and when I go to a guitar store, you have to pull me out. So that's the reason, it's sort of instinctually, those are the subjects that I go for.
Well, I want to thank all of them for being here, you for coming.